One of the most interesting things about Christianity is that its central claim can be investigated. If the body of Jesus was not resurrected from the dead, then Christianity is false. Even more interesting is that the Bible itself points this out. In 1 Corinthians 15, verses 12 through 19, Paul says that if Christ was not raised from the dead, then our faith is worthless, that we're liars, and that our sins have not been paid for. The reason the resurrection is so important to the case for Christianity is that if it is true, it confirms the teaching of Jesus as having the authority of God. The teaching of Jesus is often about his own identity, not just ethical or moral issues. At stake is the ability to know who Jesus is and how we should respond to him. The basic question to be answered is this: what's the best explanation for what happened 3 days after the execution of Jesus? We'll take a look at 8 options, including swoon theory, twin theory, hallucination, the wrong tomb, stolen body, legend, the Quranic account, and the biblical account of the resurrection. But before we can look at these theories, we must first define what resurrection is and what facts need to be accounted for by any explanation. The first thing to remember when assessing these explanations is that resurrection is not resuscitation. We're not talking about a body brought back to its former life that needs food, can get sick, ages, and will eventually die again. A resurrected state is a body that is physical yet incorruptible. It cannot die, age, or become ill. The second thing to remember is the facts that must be explained. According to the Gospels, Jesus was crucified, died on a cross, and was buried in a tomb. 3 days later, the tomb was found empty, and many of his followers claim to have seen his physical body risen from the dead over the following 40 days. Notice that these facts don't interpret their meaning, just that they happened. There are non-Christian sources, such as the Talmud, Josephus, and Pliny the Younger, that corroborate at least some of these claims. Now let's look at the different explanations. The swoon theory suggests that Jesus fainted on the cross and only appeared to be dead. Once he was in the tomb, he awoke, began recuperating, and subsequently fully recovered. In order to appreciate this argument fully, we must first understand what was involved in the torture and crucifixion of Jesus. Before being crucified, Pontius Pilate ordered that Jesus be scourged. A Roman scourging was done with a whip called a flagrum or flagellum that was comprised of a handle about 8 inches long with 12-inch to 24-inch long leather straps attached to one end. The other end of the straps were tied to lead balls, sharp pieces of metal, bone shards, broken glass, or sharp rock. Whatever was on the end of the whip quickly broke the skin and deeply penetrated the tissue, often exposing the bowels, ribs, or spine. This torture was so vicious that victims often did not survive. In crucifixion, the victim was laid down with his arms perpendicular to the torso. Nails, 5 to 9 inches long, would then be driven through the wrists, crushing the median nerve, causing extraordinary pain. Nails would also be driven through the ankles, with the legs in a bent position. When the victim was raised to a vertical position, his shoulders, and sometimes his elbows and wrists, would become dislocated from the weight, making them useless to alleviate the pressure on his chest. With the pressure on the chest, the victim could not exhale, and so he had to straighten his legs, using the nail through his ankles as leverage. Having exhaled, the victim then sunk back down to his original position. As the victim's strength slowly wore down, breathing would become less frequent, increasing the acidity of the blood. This would cause an irregular heartbeat, which was already rapid because of the loss of blood from the scourging. Death would ultimately come in the form of asphyxiation or heart failure. Depending on a victim's condition upon being put on the cross, death could sometimes take days. If the executioner wanted to speed up the process, he would break the legs of the crucified man with a club, and death would come within minutes. In the case of Jesus, the executioner was preparing to do just that, break his legs, but Jesus appeared to already be dead. To make sure, the executioner took his spear and thrust it into Jesus' side, piercing his heart and lung. If Jesus had not already died, he would have been killed. There was no question whatsoever in the mind of the professional executioner that Jesus was dead. With this in mind, let's now return to the swoon theory. For the swoon theory to be true, Jesus would have had to have not only survived the spear piercing his heart and one of his lungs, but he would have had to have faked his death well enough to fool a professional executioner. Jesus then had about 36 hours or so in the tomb to sufficiently recover from his wounds to rise. After getting up on his impaled feet, Jesus would have then had to have popped his shoulders back into place. Using hands that had lost most of their ability to function because of the nails through the wrist, Jesus would have then had to roll away an extremely heavy stone. Upon exiting the tomb, he would then have had to have overpowered a number of Roman guards using no weapons whatsoever. Then, Jesus would have had to have walked unnoticed through Jerusalem in broad daylight, not clothed properly, and with strips of flesh hanging off his body, exposing his bowels and bones, and proceed several miles down the road to Emmaus. After the evening meal, he would then have returned to Jerusalem and sneaked into a locked room where the apostles were hiding out. Even though he clearly needed immediate, intense medical treatment, he would have then had to have convinced them that he was resurrected from the dead. And then he sneaked out of the room undetected. Although this does account for the empty tomb, however implausibly, the theory does not account for anything else. In fact, it raises more questions given that the colossal fraud that would have had to have been committed by Jesus to accommodate the swoon theory is completely contradictory to everything we know of Jesus' character and teaching. The foolishness of the swoon theory is self-evident. The twin theory suggests that Jesus had an identical brother nobody knew about who took Jesus' place on the cross. The main problem with the twin theory is that there's simply no reason to believe it. The facts we do have about Jesus' family mention brothers and sisters, but no twin. Luke, whom many scholars believe may have received his information about Jesus' birth from Mary herself, makes no mention of a twin in his birth narrative. Also, for the twin theory to work, it would require Jesus' mother not to recognize the difference between her own sons. She was at the foot of the cross and had a close-up view of the man hanging there, yet we see no indication that she believed it was not Jesus but his twin. Another problem is that the theory doesn't explain the empty tomb. If it was Jesus' twin that was executed and buried, then what happened to the body? The fact that both Christians and their enemies claim the tomb was empty is a very important fact. Finally, Jesus would have had to have behaved completely contrary to his teachings to make the fraud a success. In order for this theory to work, Jesus would somehow had to have convinced or coerced the twin to spend his life in hiding and to die for Jesus' own self-aggrandizing plan that required deceit and manipulation. In fact, if this theory is true, then Jesus is not only not worthy of worship, but he deserves to be punished severely. The hallucination theory says that in the midst of their profound grief, the disciples and other followers of Jesus experienced hallucinations in which they saw him raised from the dead. These hallucinations were private in some cases and corporate in others. In these corporate hallucinations, Jesus imparted the same information to everyone having the experience. The problem with this theory is that hallucinations are entirely internal events created by the mind. The mind is not witnessing a strange event in the real world that it then struggles to interpret. The possibility of several different people having the exact same hallucination in the exact same way at the exact same time is extremely unlikely, to say the least, let alone 12 or even 500 people at once. And like the swoon theory, the hallucination theory also has the problem of the empty tomb. Thus, there is no reason to take the hallucination theory seriously.